My son went to war and came back in the wrong casket. I was folding the laundry when they knocked on my door. It was a Tuesday, late spring. The sky was trying to decide between rain and sun, and I had just pulled my lemon cake out of the oven, Henry's favorite. Funny the things you remember when your world stops spinning. I heard the knock, firm and hollow. You always know when it's that kind of knock, the kind that doesn't wait to be welcomed, the kind that arrives with heavy shoes and heavier news. I opened the door, and there they stood, two men in uniform, one young and nervous, the other older and still, like stone, like he'd done this too many times. I knew before they even spoke, Mrs. Walker. The older one asked. My knees didn't buckle, not yet. I stood up straight. Something inside me refused to make it easy for them. I nodded. We regret to inform you. I don't remember the rest, just the tone. The way his mouth kept moving, but none of the words made it past my ears. Just a soft hum, like wind inside a hollow room. My Henry, my sweet boy, my only son. He was 19, fresh out of high school, with hands too big for his sleeves and dreams even bigger than that. He wanted to fix airplanes, said he'd come back with stories, promised he'd take me to see the ocean for the first time. He left with a smile, with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and his father's watch in his pocket. And now they were telling me he wasn't coming back, except he did. 10 days later, they brought the casket, a flag draped so perfectly you'd think it had never touched dirt. They told me I didn't need to open it, said it wasn't recommended, said the injuries were severe, but I'm his mother. I changed his diapers, I kissed his skinned knees. I know the shape of his jaw, the curve of his left eyebrow, the way his thumb bent just a little wrong after he broke. It's falling out of the treehouse. And the second they wheeled that casket into the church, I knew something was wrong. They wouldn't let me near him, said the casket was sealed. For your own peace, they said. But peace doesn't come in a closed box. The funeral was quiet. Neighbors whispered, brought casseroles, hugged too long. The priest said his name like he was reading it off a piece of paper, not like someone who'd known him, not like someone who'd watched him grow. I sat in the front row, hands folded in my lap, staring at the casket, at the flag, at the silence. My husband had died 6 years earlier, a heart attack in the middle of a thunderstorm. I thought that was pain. But this was different. This wasn't loss. This was uncertainty, wrapped in wood and covered with a flag. After the burial, I stayed behind. Everyone else left. The rain had started by then, soft, respectful. I laid my hand on the wood and whispered, "Baby, if you're in there, forgive me for what I'm about to do." Because something in me couldn't let it go. Not the way they avoided my eyes. Not the way the paperwork had the wrong middle initial. Not the way his best friend's letter said he died in a firefight. When the army told me it was an explosion. The way the casket felt. Foreign, cold, wrong. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Henry's baby book in my lap, page after page of memories. His first haircut, his lost teeth, his messy handwriting, and a photo, the last one he took before leaving for Vietnam. He was smiling, but his eyes were scared. I remember that look. He used to make that face when he was hiding something. 3 days later, I wrote a letter to the army, then another, then another. Weeks passed, then months. They told me everything was by the book, that identification was verified, that the matter is closed. But I'm his mother, and I know that boy in that casket is not my son. Asterisk, asterisk, they say. Grief has 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But no one ever talks about the 6th stage, the one no one understands, the one you live in when your soul whispers, something isn't right, and the world tells you to hush. That's where I lived after they buried the boy in that casket. Everyone thought I was broken, grieving, but I wasn't. I was awake. My neighbors stopped dropping by after the 2nd month. Their cat dried up, and their pity turned to polite discomfort. I saw it in their eyes. Poor thing, can't let go. But what they didn't understand is, I wasn't holding on to hope. I was holding on to truth. I started gathering things, notebooks, articles, letters. I went through every envelope Henry ever sent me, every phrase, every word, looking for something, anything. And I found it, little inconsistencies, small contradictions. In one letter, he says he's stationed near Quang Tri, but the army's paperwork says he died near Pleiku. That's over 400 miles apart. I called the number on the army envelope. The man on the other end spoke like a script. Mrs. Walker, all details provided to you are final and have been verified by official procedure. I asked if I could speak to someone from Henry's unit. He said, "That's not how this works, ma'am." Well, it would be. I found an address in one of the envelopes, barely legible, written by a private named Thomas Tommy Barnes. Henry mentioned him a few times, said they shared cigarettes, talked about cars, joked about high school crushes. Tommy had a way with words like Henry. He didn't write often, but when he did, it mattered. I wrote to that address. Weeks passed, then a letter came. Shaky handwriting, uncertain tone. "Mrs. Walker, I remember Henry. He was a good kid, brave. He always talked about you. He said you made lemon cake that could make a grown man cry. I'm sorry I didn't write sooner. I didn't know how to, but I don't know what they told you. But Henry didn't die in an explosion. He was shot. He bled out in my arms. I held his hand. I said your name, and he looked up like he could see you." I dropped the letter on the table. My chest hurt. I thought I couldn't cry anymore. Asterisk, I was wrong. Shot, not an explosion. That was the second time they got it wrong. I wrote back, asked Tommy what Henry looked like, what he wore, what he said in his final moment. And his answers, they matched. Everything I knew, right down to the scar above Henry's left eyebrow. The one he got falling off his bike when he was 9. But that boy they buried. The army said his body was too damaged for identification. And yet, Tommy saw his face. Brought that letter to the local VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars post, and showed it to the commander, an older man named Ray, Vietnam vet. Quiet, serious, he read the letter, then looked at me and said, "You believe your boy's still out there, don't you?" "No," I said. "I believe my boy's not in that grave." He nodded slowly, then handed me a folder. Inside were photos, lists, declassified case files, mismatched reports, mistaken identities, men buried under wrong names, families who never knew. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't grieving wrong. I was right. But that knowledge didn't bring me peace. It brought me rage. What else had they gotten wrong? Why did no one want to talk about it? Who was that boy in my son's grave? And most of all, where was Henry? They told me the system was solid. They said everything had been done by the book, that the reports were clear, the procedures followed. But I've lived too long to believe that order equals truth. I've seen too much to think paperwork can recognize a mother's grief, or that a typed name on a folded flag can erase the feeling in your chest when you know something isn't right. I started asking questions, too many, maybe. I went to the county office, requested every document the army had sent. I read each line like a prayer, like a warning, like I was searching for a lie buried between the letters, and there it was. Small things, different dates. One record said he died on March 8. Another said March 21st. One said explosion. Another said gunshot wound. They used phrases like fog of war and field confusion, but I call it something else. I call it negligence. I call it miscare. I call it forgetting that every number on a report is someone's son, someone's baby, someone who had a favorite meal and a crooked smile. I called the number on the report. Again, asked for someone higher up. They transferred me 3 times, each voice more rehearsed than the last. Finally, I said, "I want the dental records." A pause, then a man cleared his throat and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, that's not possible." "But why not? Why can't I see proof that my boy is the one you buried? Why can't I know for certain that the body you handed me is the same child I raised? Why do you get to be sure?" And I have to guess, they didn't like that. I received a letter a week later, formal, cold, unsigned, said my continued inquiries were disrupting protocol, as if grief is an inconvenience, as if a mother's questions are an act of war. But I didn't stop, because now it wasn't just about Henry. It was about the boy in that casket, the one I buried under my son's name, the one whose mother might still be waiting, still sitting at the kitchen table, still writing letters that would never be answered, still turning on a porch light every night, thinking he'd come walking up the steps again. I went to the press, local first, then state. Most didn't call back, but one man did, a quiet journalist named Carl. He came to my house with a notebook and sad eyes, listened for 2 hours without interrupting, then asked, "Do you have a photo of the casket before it was buried?" I showed him, and he stared for a long time, too long. He came back 3 days later with an old army contact. a man with silver hair and hands that trembled when he held the file. They sat in my living room and told me what I already knew, that there had been mix-ups, that in the final months of the war, they had too many bodies and too few answers, that identification got rushed, that sometimes tags were burned and teeth don't lie, but no one checked the teeth. I asked one question straight into their eyes. Can you tell me with certainty that the boy I buried was Henry? And they looked away. That was my answer. There's something hollow about knowing you buried the wrong boy. It's not just grief anymore, it's guilt. A guilt that doesn't belong to you, but you carry it anyway, because someone has to, because someone out there might be lighting a candle every night for a son who's already in the ground, under a name that isn't his, after the visit from Call and the army contact. I couldn't sleep. I would sit in Henry's old room, still painted pale green, still full of dust and echoes, his bookshelf untouched, his baseball cap hanging where he'd left it. I'd hold the picture of him in uniform, stare into his eyes, and whisper, "I'm sorry, baby, I'm still trying." Carl called a few days later, said he found something, an old report, sealed but not classified, a transfer file for an unidentified soldier, same date, same base, same incident, except this one had no name, just a code, subject 1349. His body was shipped stateside the same day Henry's was declared Kia, but his ID tag was missing, burned, they said, or lost. Carl pulled some strings. The file included a description: height, build, hair color, dental condition, and a tattoo, a small blue star on the inside of his wrist. My Henry didn't have a tattoo. I would have known, but the boy in the casket I buried, he had one. I remember, a tiny faded mark barely visible beneath the formal gloves they placed on him. I saw it when they let me touch his hand, just once, cold and stiff, but still a hand, still skin, still someone's child. The star, it was the proof I needed, and the wound I didn't want, because now I had to ask, if that boy wasn't Henry, then who was he, and where was my son? I filed a formal request to exhume the body. It took weeks, forms, signatures, waiting, a quiet protest from my church friends. Let him rest, they said, but he never belonged to rest that way. Not with a false name above him, not while his real mother still waited. The day came, a quiet, overcast morning. Only me, Carl, and the man from the army. The casket was lifted, dirt falling like dust from memory, and when they opened it, the truth was there, not loud, not dramatic, just final. He was young, too young, not Henry, wrong jawline, wrong teeth, that star still on his wrist, no letter in his pocket, no trace of my boy. Carl placed a hand on my shoulder. The army man said, "We'll initiate a full investigation," but I wasn't listening anymore. I was looking at that boy I called Henry for months, prayed over, mourned for, buried, and I whispered to him, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. You weren't mine, but you mattered." I arranged for him to be buried again, this time with no name, just a plaque that read, "Known by the heart, lost by the war," and I placed a flower by his side, one for me, and one for the mother who never got to know where her son went. But now, I had another grave, another silence, another truth. My son, my Henry, was still missing. They told me closure comes with time, with answers, with a folded flag and a final word. But for me, closure never came. Not in the way they meant. Not with the kind of silence that follows a grave that holds someone else's child. Not when your own blood is still somewhere out there. Maybe gone, maybe not. Maybe in another grave with the wrong name, or maybe in a jungle forgotten by both map and memory. I stopped asking the army for help. They stopped replying anyway. The letters turned cold, like winter in a house with no fire. They said there was nothing left to search, that some files were lost, that recovery efforts had ended years ago. I heard the apology in their voices, but I also heard the exhaustion, the kind that doesn't fight for the truth anymore. I started talking to Henry out loud, not just in my head. I would sit by the window in the morning, coffee in my hands, the porch lights still on, even in daylight, and I would say, "Good morning, sweetheart," like he was just in the next room, like I hadn't buried a stranger in his name. Like his laugh might drift through the house, if I just listened hard enough. People moved on, the world kept spinning. The neighbors stopped asking, the casserole dishes stopped coming back, even the church ladies offered quieter smiles. The kind you give someone you've decided can't be helped, but I never needed their pity. I needed the sound of my son's boots on the porch again, the weight of his hug, the voice that called me Ma like it still had a boy's innocence in it. I kept a box under my bed, filled with every letter, every photo, every newspaper clipping that mentioned names I recognized or places he might have been. I didn't organize it. I didn't need to. Every corner of that box lived in my mind already. I knew what each piece meant, what moment it came from. I carried the whole box inside me even when my hands were empty. One night, I dreamed of him, not as he was in uniform, but younger, much younger, barefoot in the backyard, holding a jar with a firefly inside. He looked at me and said, "You'll find me, Mama." And I woke up with tears I didn't know I had left. I took it as a sign, or maybe just a comfort. But I held it close like a candle that refuses to go out in the wind. Years passed, seasons came and went like pages torn from a book I never wanted to read. I grew older, slower, but never quieter. I told Henry's story to anyone who'd listen, veterans, students, reporters, strangers on benches, and sometimes they cried, sometimes they nodded, but mostly they just listened. And that was enough. For a while, I never remarried, never left that house. Never stopped turning on the porch light, not because I believed he'd walk through the door, but because I wanted the world to remember that someone was still missing, that some wars don't end with treaties, they end with mothers still searching, still waiting, still whispering their child's name into the quiet. And now, with these hands old and soft, I still write him letters, even if I burn them after. I still set an extra place at the table on his birthday. I still leave the window open in the summer, like I used to when he couldn't sleep. And when I sit in my rocking chair, I hum the tune I used to sing when he was a baby, not because I think he hears it, but because I do. They say grief softens with time, but that's not true. It changes shape. It learns to walk with you. It becomes the way you speak, the way you fold laundry, the way you water plants, the way you hold your breath at the sound of boots outside your door. It becomes the way you keep a place set, the way you trace old photos, the way you press your fingers to the name etched in a stone that might not belong to your child at all. I sometimes wonder what I'd say to him if he did walk through that door, older now, weathered, changed by time and sorrow and war. Would I recognize his face? Would I know his voice? Would he still call me Ma? Or would he just stand there, like a memory brought to life, unsure of how to fit into a world that tried to bury him twice? And I wonder if he forgives me for letting them put someone else in the ground under his name, for letting them hand me a flag as if it were enough, for not finding him sooner, for not being louder, fiercer, faster, younger. I wonder if he knows that I never stopped, not for a single day, not even when the world told me it was time to let go. But here's the thing. Some of us don't get to let go. Some of us carry the war long after the soldiers are gone. We carry it in our kitchens, in our prayers, in our aching backs and shaking hands, in the way we sit a little longer at the table, in the way we never stop checking the mail, in the way we keep one drawer full of things no one else understands. So if you pass by my house and see that little light glowing, know that it's not for decoration, it's not habit, it's not nostalgia, it's not superstition, it's a message, a promise, a protest, a poem written in light. It's a mother's vow that even if her son never comes home, even if the truth is never fully known, even if the world forgets, she won't. And if you listen closely, on a quiet night, when the world is asleep and only the porch light burns, you might hear her rocking gently, humming low, whispering his name like a prayer, like a story she refuses to let die, because some loves don't end with death, they end with remembering, and I remember, I always will.